Hello there, Ben Powers, the Spirit Specialist, and this is a video with a bit of a difference. This is a video to accompany the Campbeltown collection sample selection box that I put together after I was fortunate enough to get a tiny allocation of a couple of Springbanks and a Kilkerran. So rather than have my customers basically fight over it, I thought I'd decant them into a sample pack along with a couple of other Campbeltown releases to give more people the chance to actually try some of these whiskies that are just getting so hard to get hold of or are just becoming ridiculously expensive because there are unfortunately retailers out there that are just taking the piss, basically, out of you, the drinker, knowing that some of these are in such demand and just whacking the price up. For example, Springbank 10-year-old, which is in this box, I have seen on some places and Amazon for £150 a bottle. And the retail price is about 50-ish. So it's just crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And I'd much rather more people manage to try these than one person potentially get a bottle off me that might flip it. Now, most of my customers I know aren't those type of people, but I think it's just, if I literally get one bottle, I'd much rather 20 odd people actually get to try it than it go to one person who might share it, but might just keep hold of it. So with this video, I've kind of called it a drink along, but I'm not actually going to be drinking any of these. What I've done is I've put some videos together, kind of like separate pieces, a bit like my background information for when I do review videos, but we're going to look at Campbeltown as a whole, the history of that region, and then we're going to look at the 3 distilleries and then the whiskies that are from those distilleries. So in this sample pack, and you can see here that I've put it all together. Now I've put this in an order as if you were doing a tasting, essentially. So if you've got some of these with some friends or you fancy going through the whole box in one go, if I was doing this as a tasting event with an audience, I would be doing it in this order, but feel free to kind of like pick and choose whichever ones you want. And the videos will be each distillery and each bottling from that distillery. I'm not going to put the sort of background of each bottle in the order as though it was a tasting, just because you're going to be looking at, here's about Glen Scotia, then we're going to jump to Springbank, then we're going to go back to Glen Scotia. So I'm going to try and condense them into sort of 3 separate parts. Glen Scotia, Springbank, and then because it's right at the end, we'll put Glengyle / Kilkerran at the end of it. And I'll stick Campbeltown Loch kind of in that. So we've got the Glen Scotia, so the double cask, which is one of my favorites, but this is the relatively new one. I think it came out last year before. This is their rum cask finish. Whereas the original double cask was PX, so first fill bourbon casks and then finished off in PX sherry casks. This is finished off in a rum cask. Basically, I put this in the pack because I hadn't tried it yet and I wanted to try some, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. Then we've got the classic Springbank 10, potentially one of the best whiskies out there, full stop. Then we go back to Glen Scotia, and this is the first of their limited edition. They called it Icons of Campbeltown. So this is called the Mermaid. This is a Paolo Cortado finish, 12-year-old. Very, very interesting. Really, really different, unusual. Also bottled at cask strength, so that's 54.1%. Then, speaking of cask strength, we've got the Springbank 12-year-old cask strength. So this is the 2023 release, so this is 57.2%. Then another all-time classic, Campbeltown Loch. Reason that this is after the Springbank 12-year-old is that there is some peated whiskey in this, so it would potentially affect the flavour. Campbeltown Loch, blended malt, malt whiskies taken from the 3 distilleries currently operating on Campbeltown. So there is Glen Scotia, there is Kilkerran, Glengyle, and there is Springbank in this, along with Longrow and Hazelburn. And then we have the Kilkerran heavily peated batch 10, so that's this year's release. Cask strength again, 57.8. So feel free to kind of dip in and out of this as you wish, but hopefully the accompanying videos, snippets, will be giving you some background information, some context in terms of where these are made, the distilleries that are making them, and then also what the constituent parts are within each bottle. So enjoy. If you have any feedback, do let me know. If you want some more kind of packs and background videos like this, that you can kind of do your own tasting event if you wanted to, then let me know and we'll get something sorted out. So with the Campbeltown collection, the 2024 edition, because I did one last year, maybe there'll be a 2025 edition if I manage to get some good allocations. Any allocation would be nice, to be honest. I hope you enjoy, and I shall see you in the next video. Cheers. Campbeltown is a town on the Kintyre Peninsula to the west of the Scottish mainland. Once known as the Victorian whisky capital of the world, by 1900 the region contained nearly 30 distilleries in a condensed area, mainly due to shipping routes not only to Ireland and America, but also across to Glasgow. However, many distilleries then closed in the 1920s due to improved transportation links across the rest of the country, coupled with a downturn in the post-war economy, especially with prohibition in the US. There now remain just 3 distilleries: Springbank, Glengyle, which was reopened by the owners of Springbank in 2004, and Glen Scotia. At the time of recording, in 2024, there are also 3 new distillery ventures planned for the region: Dalriata, Witchburn and Machrihanish, taking advantage of the great reputation of the region and the fact the likes of Islay are becoming just too overcrowded. The Glen Scotia distillery was built in 1832 by Stuart Galbraith and Company, although it was originally just named Scotia. In 1891, it was purchased by whisky entrepreneur Duncan Macallan, but he was forced to close it in 1928, and in 1930 Macallan took his own life in the nearby Crosshill Loch after losing his fortunes. Indeed, his ghost is said to haunt the Glen Scotia distillery to this day. That year, it was purchased by the Bloch brothers blending business, who added the Glen prefix. In 1954, it was bought by Canadian whisky giant Hiram Walker and Sons, but it only lasted 12 months in their hands until another transfer of ownership took place. After a number of acquisitions and mergers, it was eventually transferred to Glen Katrine Bonded Warehousing in 1994, who immediately mothballed the site. 5 years later, production restarted in full and the brand began to grow again. In 2014, the private equity firm Exponent, who were also owners of the Loch Lomond distillery, purchased the operation for £210 million and rebranded the portfolio, focusing on a more premium market. The move proved a success when the Chinese investment firm Hill House purchased the Loch Lomond Group, including Glen Scotia, for £393 million. The distillery produces an output of around 700,000 litres per year, with 1 wash still and 1 spirit still. It's known as a whisky that offers a profile of sea air and gently coastal notes. The original double cask release from Glen Scotia is a core bottling that can be seen as an introduction to the distillery. It offers a slightly sweet flavour profile thanks to a finish in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks, following initial maturation for around 5 to 6 years in first fill ex-bourbon barrels. Launched in 2022, the rum cask finish sees the same ex-bourbon matured spirit instead finished for 8 months in rum barrels sourced from the Diamond Distillery in Guyana, producers of Demerara rum known for notes of brown sugar and sweet treacle. It's bottled at an ABV of 46%. The first limited edition release of a series titled Icons of Campbeltown, the Mermaid is a homage to the many community stories of mermaid sightings along the shores, something that was commonly repeated during the whisky making boom of the 1800s, and maybe there is a connection. Unpeated spirit is aged for around 11 years in ex-bourbon barrels, before a time spent finishing in Paulo Cortado sherry barrels. Paulo Cortado is a slightly dry style of sherry that sits between an Amontillado and an Oloroso and is not often used in whisky maturation, echoing the rarity of a mermaid sighting. Glen Scotia the Mermaid is bottled at a cask strength of 54.1% ABV. The 14th licensed distillery to open in Campbeltown, Springbank was founded in 1828 by William Reed and his family, but after encountering financial difficulties, it was acquired by John and William Mitchell just 9 years later. The distillery was built on the site of an illicit still run by William's brother-in-law Archibald Mitchell, and John and William were his sons. Indeed, the Mitchell family as a whole were already involved in a number of distilleries in the region, so it was pretty much a natural turn of events. With Campbeltown becoming a hub of whisky making during the mid to late 1800s, Springbank was a success, including supplying John Walker's blending business, and in 1897 J&A Mitchell & Co was established to secure the family ownership of the distillery. The rapid collapse of the whisky market during the 1920s saw Springbank barely hang on for survival, and a move to making a lighter spirit with less peat influence saw them remain attractive to blenders. Nevertheless, Springbank still closed in 1926 before returning to production in 1933. The permanent closure of the Reclacken distillery in 1934 would leave Springbank and Glen Scotia as the only operating distilleries in Campbeltown. Springbank would continue to malt its own barley throughout this time, but in 1960 the malting floors were closed and malted barley brought in from an outside source. Geographically isolated as they were, and with a bottling line that was underutilised, in 1969 J&A Mitchell purchased the independent bottler and spirits merchant Cadenhead, enabling Cadenhead to remain a separate enterprise but bottled their own releases. As demand for smoky whisky grew, in 1973 Springbank distilled the first run of a heavily peated spirit that would be named after the nearby Long Row distillery, which closed in 1896. Another downturn in the whisky market saw the distillery close again in 1979, but Springbank whisky continued to be sold through Cadenhead and the first Longer Row bottling was released in 1985. In 1989, Springbank returned to full production, and owner Hedley Wright, the great-great-grandson of John Mitchell, saw the opportunity to take advantage of a growing interest in single malt Scotch whiskies. In 1992, the malting floor was revived, and Springbank became the only self-sufficient distillery in Scotland, with malting, distillation and bottling taking place on a single site. A triple distilled, non-peated spirit was first distilled in 1997 and would be named after another neighbouring distillery, Hazelburn, which closed in 1925. Hedley Wright passed away at the age of 92 in August 2023. With one wash still and two spirit stills, Springbank has the capacity to produce around 750,000 litres of spirit, but the actual output is much less than this as the focus is on maintaining a consistency of quality. The low output has made releases incredibly sought after, and secondary prices can be quite frankly ridiculous, but one can't argue that the liquid itself is more often than not richly deserves its accolades, with a rich, oily note that is quite superb. Considered by some drinkers not to be only the best release from Springbank, but also the best release in Scotch whisky as a whole, Springbank 10-year-old is produced in small batches annually, with maturation taking place in a combination of 60% ex-bourbon and 40% ex-Oloroso sherry barrels. It's bottled at an ABV of 46%. The 12-year-old cask strength has the same proportion of cask maturation as the 10-year-old, 60% ex-bourbon, 40% ex-Oloroso sherry barrels, but each annual bottling is released at a slightly different alcohol level due to the nature of evaporation. Whereas the 2023 release had an ABV of 54.1%, this particular 2024 edition is bottled at an ABV of 57.2%. Although brothers John and William Mitchell purchased the Springbank distillery from William Reid in 1837 and ran a successful whisky-making operation, following a family quarrel in 1872, William left the business and opened his own distillery named Glengyle. Whereas Springbank managed to survive the recession of the early 1900s and onwards, Glengyle suffered, and in 1919 William sold the distillery to West Highland Malt Distilleries, who at the time also owned Glen Scotia, among others. But in 1925 the operation was closed down in full. In 1940, the Bloch brothers, who also owned Glen Scotia, attempted to purchase the distillery, but unstable financial conditions meant the deal fell apart at the last minute. The buildings would eventually be used as warehouses, feed stores and even a rifle range over the years, until Hedley Wright, owner of Springbank and descendant of William Mitchell, purchased the site in November 2000 with the intention of renovating and restarting production. On March 25, 2004, the first distillation of spirit took place, which would eventually be named Kilkerran after St. Kieran, the creator of the original settlement where Campbeltown now stands. With one wash still and one spirit still, Glengyle is able to distill around 170 litres of alcohol per year, but as with Springbank, a much lower amount is produced to maintain consistency. The house style tends to be slightly smoky, but heavily peated bottlings are also released. A departure from the typically lightly peated core releases, heavily peated Kilkerran is released twice per year at cask strength with a phenol level of around 45 ppm. Although maturation varies with each release, it's typically matured predominantly in bourbon casks. In the case of batch 10, the split is 90% ex-bourbon to 10% ex-Oloroso sherry barrels, released at an ABV of 57.8%. Produced and bottled at the Springbank distillery by J&A Mitchell, Campbeltown Loch is a marriage of the 5 types of whisky currently produced by the 3 operating distilleries in the region: Spirit from Glen Scotia, Kilkerran from Glengyle, and the house whisky alongside Long Row and Hazelburn from Springbank itself. For a drinker looking to taste the output of a specific whisky region in one single glass, one cannot ask for much more. It's bottled at an ABV of 46%.